Ah,
He's
dear.
coming
Well,
again.
where are we, Nippon?
Good question. Um, we are in one of those famous temples in Chennai. Don't ask me the name of the temple.
Yes, yes.
It's a little bit difficult, but yeah, we saw the priest sitting with us just now, and yeah, we ended up having a conversation with him about the different gods in this place.
Yes.
Every temple, there are about 6 temples here, and all of them represent a god. But Rob, I think it would be a wonderful place, an ideal place to have a discussion about this whole idea of a myth.
Yes.
What is a myth? Let's
Yes.
just talk about that.
Okay, so just in case people don't hear us properly, mythology, myth. So we spoke in a previous video about methodology, that the word ology means the philosophy of, the study of. So mythology is the philosophy of myth. Mythology, very, very quickly. People misunderstand myth as fairy tale and fantasy. And anyone who studies myth know it's neither. It is not fairy tale and it's not fantasy. But it's not truth, maximum truth or absolute truth either. And it's not even a reality. It's a created reality by the myth, confirmed by symbols and rituals. So most myths are made myths by ritual and symbol and story, and usually all three combine to form a myth. That doesn't mean that myths are not meaningful. They're very, very meaningful. And there are a range of meanings within myth. So there are some myths that are strong, closer to reality, and some myths that are not as strong, helpful, but not as powerful as certain other myths. And so there are a range of myths, just like there are in Greek history or Roman history. There are a range of myths and a range of gods attached to each myth, and that god becomes the symbol for the myth. This place here, very, very similar. Each one of these gods, each one of these myths attached to each god has meaning for these people. They come here, and this is very meaningful for them. And each story attached to each myth and each archetype gives them an energy, an amazing energy. It's like the god is a power source, and you plug into it. What do you think myth is?
Yeah, I have struggled with this idea of what is a myth for a very, very long time. And one of the reasons was that I always looked at myth through the lenses of science, which is a myth in its own. So typically people would say this is mythical and this is true. And what they mean is that this is the truth and this is false. So everything that is mythical is false.
Yes.
Is untrue.
Yes.
So we get trapped into this very, scientific, so-called scientific narrative. And we are so busy falsifying all the myths, debunking myths,
Yes.
and so on. But I think I've come to realize that, and especially in the last couple of years, is that a myth is not true or untrue. A myth is what gives meaning to us. So there are 3 levels of truth. The absolute truth, which is very, very rare, but there are certain things which are absolutely true, you could say in some way. So if you don't eat food or you don't drink water for a few days, you might die. And that's a truth. That's an absolute truth. Well, it's close to an absolute truth.
Yes.
But of course, some could argue that if you enter into meditation, you probably can overcome that bit also. Well, it's still, for a common person, it's still very close to an absolute truth. And then you have myth. Myth is the truth of a group of people. That group can extend from a family all the way up to a continent.
Yes.
Or even the whole planet. In the risk and safety industry, 0 is a myth because it gives meaning to people when something happens. And prevention is a myth.
And it's symbolized.
It's symbolized, yes.
And it has a narrative.
That's right. That's right. So, and then you have the 3rd level, which is the fantasy. The fantasy is neither a myth nor a truth. It is a fantasy of one individual person which sits in his or her head.
Yeah, imagination.
So, yes, that's right. Yes. Now, you talked about mythology and myth. So a mythology is the study of myth, and myth is what we describe, which is what gives meaning to a group of people.
Yes.
And I think there is something else which is called a mythosphere. So like a semiosphere, you talk about semiosphere,
Yeah.
and there is atmosphere, there is something called a mythosphere.
Yes.
So a mythosphere is like you're sitting in India right now, and all those myths that are surrounding us
Yes.
have a collective meaning,
Yes.
right? So in this culture, for example, everything is tied to the idea that, Earth is, no, we have a connection with Earth, and we have a relationship with nature. So we work together with nature.
Yes.
That's you could say at some level it's a big myth.
Yeah.
Now there are smaller myths that support that myth. So not only do you worship animals, not only do you worship people, but you also worship rocks and rivers and trees and so on.
Yes.
So what happens is that a mythosphere holds different myths together. That's why the idea of a mythosphere is so important. Now you go to a developed country like, the so-called developed country, which is a myth again, then they have a different myth, which is that the whole idea of life is to fight against the nature.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah? So we can somehow overcome the nature.
Conquer.
Yes, we can conquer the nature. So we have different myths that surround it.
Yes.
So for example, an accident happened, we have to find a cause. Is the myth of certainty. Even if we don't have one, we must create one.
Yeah, create one.
We must find somebody to scapegoat, which is again a myth.
Yes.
Because if we did not scapegoat someone, an organization or the whole society will come down.
And we find that answer through another myth like Swiss cheese,
That's right.
which is a fantasy. James Reason invents this fantasy for an industry that wants linear truth.
That's right.
And they now have all of these things which are symbolized. Symbolism's very important to myth.
Yes.
So he's got this mythology which confirms it as true. And then they call it science. There's nothing about it that is scientific.
That's right.
Yes.
So in a mythosphere, that idea of science,
Yes.
which is scientism, which is positivism,
Yeah.
which is deductive reasoning,
Yep.
linear reasoning,
Yes.
holds together so well because it
Within
holds
its own assumptions.
That's right.
Yes.
The trouble is that when you come from that myth and you want to impose your myth onto the 3.5 billion people
Yes.
who don't belong to the Abrahamic faith.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah? So what do? You demonize them.
Yes.
So you take over another company in another part of the world,
We'll take over a country.
take over
India.
a country.
The British.
Yeah.
The British come to
That's-
India and say, I know what, we want all your gold.
That's right,
We
yes.
want all your diamonds. We want all your rubies. We want everything you got. We'll send in all our missionaries and we'll prove to you that your myths are wrong.
That's right. And we go back to the idea of proving the myth as a writer. And
yeah.
isn't that interesting? Because the earlier Victorian anthropologists did exactly that. They went to other parts of the world, and because they could not understand the rituals and the symbols of those people,
Yes.
they called them savages and barbarians.
Savages, that's right. Yeah,
Because
the ignorant.
somebody was speaking words like ba, 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 ba to them.
Yes.
They couldn't understand
No,
that
that's
language,
right.
and they called
And
them
they didn't
barbarians.
read or write.
No.
Like the Aboriginal Australians only communicated through dream time. So if
That's
you
right.
couldn't read and write, you were ignorant.
And what did we see yesterday in Mahabalipuram?
Yeah.
Nothing written. 3,000 years of history.
Yeah.
We went around
No-
each and
no
every...
text.
Yes, even here.
Yeah,
even
no
here.
text
There are
here.
so many gods and goddesses.
Yeah.
If you ask somebody, they will tell you.
Oh, yes.
But they will not write it to
Yes.
explain to you what this means, because
Yes.
they want you to
Yes.
realize your own myth.
Well, even within Western society in the discipline of history, anyone who is a decent historian knows that oral history is just as important as written history.
I think that's a very powerful point in myth, because if you look at myth through the lenses of history and through the lenses of what is right and wrong, then history becomes what is politically justified. We go back to the same idea that my truth is more important
Yeah,
because
yes.
it's documented,
Yeah,
and I
correct.
can prove it. You can't.
Yeah, this.
Yeah, so that's a society that's seduced by the idea of certainty, objectivity.
Yeah.
It's all holds together so well until you come to another part of the world and you're totally gobsmacked.
Yes, that's right.
And what do you do when you're gobsmacked? You don't try to understand the myth
Oh,
of the
no.
person. You just demonize it. And this is precisely what happens when we go and do safety audits. You go on a ship, you go on an oil rig, you don't understand their myth, you don't understand their rituals,
No.
you don't understand their words, and because you're so busy superimposing on them your own myth.
Yes, and unfortunately, people like Matt, the poor bugger, has to do audits to make money, right? He would rather do sport, but he has to do audits every day to be paid, and knowing that the audit is a myth.
It is. It is. It is.
But he has to do it.
But we go back to it holds together so well in a mythosphere.
Oh, within their
Yes.
mythosphere. And yet I look at myths like the coloured matrix, the bow tie, Heinrich's pyramid, all of those myths which are symbolised in safety, they actually believe in them by faith. They
do.
put their faith in that symbol, even though it has no science, no logic, no rationality, but the image of the symbol makes sense to them because they've been indoctrinated to say, see, all actions happen in a line with the cheese and they all line up. Then they take that to an accident and they make that myth work for them, and it's utter nonsense.
So here's an interesting one. So what is the biggest myth here? The biggest myth here is an organization is all about systems and controls to create a predictable future.
Yes.
And we all know, living through this pandemic and these uncertain times,
Yeah.
that is so far from truth.
Oh, yes.
So in a way, what we are an alternative perspective that we are promoting, and take it or leave it, it's entirely up to you, is that an organization is as much as about it is about systems and control. It's about people and understanding
Yes.
and relationships.
Yes.
And I think that myth actually brings together people.
Yes.
Because in that mythosphere, what
Yeah.
happens is that if I don't understand you, Rob,
Yes.
I make an attempt to ask you, so what do you mean
Well,
by
that's
that?
right.
Yeah.
But that requires humility, and that requires a question. And I find all the time in risk and safety. I read a book recently called The Science of the Wheeler Masters, and this is the latest research in quantum physics. And here's people in quantum physics, the absolute peak of scientists, saying quantum physics is exactly the same as Buddhism. That we speak the same language, we speak the same philosophy, and they argue in the book, and the scientists argue in the book, the philosophers, saying that, guess what? We've come back to the marriage again of science and mythology. It's come together back again, like it used to be at the start of science. So way back in the early days, when Newton and these people in science in London, they all had religious beliefs, and they also believed in Christian myths, and they also believed in science, and they could juggle both together. Then when it moved into the 1900s, we got rid of religion, and now we've gone into quantum physics, we're back.
That's right.
Amazing.
All the latest research is showing exactly that.
Yes.
That science and art has to live together.
Yeah, correct.
That's how
correct,
you
yeah.
experience the world.
Yes, yes.
So we bring a bunch of people together in a building, and it's a temple of physics.
I don't understand.
Is that so? Their common narrative is physics, and so they're there, they live, and
I think it's the reverse.
Yeah.
I think the quantum physicists are now acknowledging that they don't know very much at all, because no one's been into a black hole and come out. Nothing comes out of a black hole, not even gravity. So the logic of a black hole defies all of our logic about gravity. So everything we thought about gravity for 250 years is now wrong. It's wrong. We now can observe gravity disappearing into a black hole, and we can't understand it because there's no knowledge coming out. Well, that's the same as God. So you go to an average person who believes in a God and say, prove your God.
You just look at
They
you.
can't,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Then you go to a quantum physicist and say, okay, prove your belief. And so how many of us have been inside a black hole and come back out? Nobody.
You can't
And
prove
so
it.
that's what they're saying. Science and this whole mythology of the scientific method and proof has massive limits now. It's limited, just like faith is limited.
Yeah.
But it shares more in common with faith and mythology now than we've ever thought.
But I think it goes back to where we started, that if you think of myth as something that needs to be debunked, it's something to be
Yes.
falsified, then you are back into that same
Yes.
place, which is right and wrong.
Yeah, well, because they turn all myth into fantasy.
That's right.
So they have fantasy and non-fantasy.
That's right.
Yes.
Yes.
But it's not like that.
No.
There's a whole dialectic
That's
between.
right.
Yeah.
When you start to look at myth as something which is incomplete knowledge,
Yes.
it's so far away from absolute knowledge.
Yes.
I mean, at the end of the day, we are all seeking that absolute. We are all
Yes,
doing that.
of
But
course.
we all know that it's inaccessible. It cannot be
Of course.
accessed.
No. Well.
So wouldn't it be so nice if we live with that idea that my truth and your truth can only make a better truth,
yes, that's right.
rather than saying my truth and your truth,
Is
one
the
of us has to
yeah,
win.
that's-
Yeah.
One of us have to move. I have the only truth. You have nothing.
Especially if you are the one more powerful.
Oh
than
yes,
me.
I have the best checklist.
yeah.
You're wrong.
Yeah. So I think that peaceful message that when you start to live and believe that all myth is mythical,
Yes.
you know, whether it's my myth or your myth,
Yeah.
we become a lot more humble
Yes.
and curious about
Yes.
the world around
Yes.
us.
Okay, so Christians can't, and Buddhists and Hindus can't explain death, but science can't explain death either. No one knows what death is.
I think that the trouble is that a lot of this science originates
Yeah.
from Abrahamic faith.
Yes, it does.
And the trouble is that at least half the population of the world is not
It's not Abrahamic, no.
So what do you do with
No,
that?
that's right. That's right. Well, and what you do is you land in Australia and you start killing Aboriginals as fast as you can.
Isn't
Wow. Imperialism, 200 years of imperialism is all about you send in the missionaries, you send in the guns, and you try to annihilate what you don't believe. Wow.
Convert or else.
Yes. We should probably stop it there, I think.
So, yeah. It was a wonderful discussion. Is there anything you wanted to say in closing?
Yeah, we kind of left you out.
Yeah, no, I was quite happy listening and learning. So if somebody
More
wanted
books to read by
a book-
Mary Douglas.
Thank
Yes,
you.
more
You're right
books.
there.
Yeah.
Mercia Eliade, who else would you suggest?
Mary Midgley.
Yeah,
Myths
and
we live by.
Mary Douglas, very, very important. And maybe the hero myth they should read by
Joseph Campbell. Yeah.
by Campbell, Joseph Campbell.
And there's another one you should read, Devdutt Patnaik. He's an Indian mythologist. You must read him.
Yeah,
He's
yeah,
so good.
very good.
Yes, yes.
So great.
Ooh.
So there's some reference that
Yeah.
we can all start reading.
Yep.
Oh, there's amazing. I mean, yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
So we should get our tuk-tuk driver.
Yes.
Now we should go to a Christian church nearby and look at myths.
Leadership.
And myths, though.
And leadership.
Yeah, and
When we talk
leadership.
about leadership.
Because we could talk about leadership myths for a long time.
That's
And,
right, it is.
and you know, or I'm sorry to tell most people who go to an MBA, it's all mythology.
It's all mythology.
It's all mythology.
And it's so far away from absolute truth.
Yes, it is. It is. All right, we'll finish that there.
Great. Thank you.